I want to welcome everybody to our final parallel session for today. And I want to thank you very much for joining us. My name is Maureen Hahn. I'm the President and CEO of the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, CCRW. And it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to your moderator for this session, Steve Esty. Steve, take it away.
Great, thanks, Maureen. Hi, everybody out there in Zoom land. I'm joined today by three quite distinguished colleagues. I feel very fortunate that they've taken the time to speak with us. I think that their bios are contained in the conference package, so I won't review those. Safe to say, we've had an opportunity over the last couple of years to have a number of similar conversations in the area of international business and disability. And they've been happening mostly in the context of UN conferences of states parties and so on. But when Maureen approached me about this conference, I thought it would be a really interesting opportunity to speak with some of these folks. Again, in this context, I will start by noting the painfully obvious that the gender balance on this panel simply does not exist. And I would say that I had invited three women to participate as well, mindful of that gender balance, but they all had better offers. So there's nothing I can do about that. I apologize to you, but I just wanted to be upfront and recognize it. We'll do our best. And our hope today is to have a free-ranging discussion. The question and answer box is open. If people want to engage, you needn't wait until the end. I've got a couple of questions that panel members will respond to in an informal sort of way. And if people who are joining us have thoughts and comments, then you're welcome to share them as well. I would ask everyone to keep their intervention brief so that we have an opportunity to have a free-ranging discussion. And with that, let me start off by putting the first question on the table. I'm sorry, folks, that's too much paper here. It's just simply a question about the COVID-19 recovery. And I mean, we have panel members here. Francis is Canadian, but Murtaza is with the Bangladesh Business Disability Forum, and Stefan is with the International Labour Organization. So, I mean, most participants in this conference are Canadian, and I think that we would probably really value some perspective from an international side. And I know, Murtaza, that while you're working in Bangladesh, you've been kind of stuck in Europe for a while, but I'm sure you have some sense of what things are like there. And Stefan, I'm certain you have a wide sense of things as well. So let me just put the question out to you and see what your thoughts are in terms of COVID-19 recovery and people with disabilities. Stefan, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks, Stephen, for inviting me to this event. Thank you also for flagging the bad gender balance, or the lack of any gender balance. I also was a bit struck when I saw us. But okay, it's clear. Look, let me start with the bad news, and then let me give some perhaps silver lining, if I understand well the concept. Also some positive issues that are also coming out of the crisis. The negative part is that I would say, first, we don't have any good, with the few exceptions, we don't have good statistical evidence on the impact of COVID-19 on the employment levels of persons with disabilities. And I'm highlighting that because it shows that even in those countries where there has been some labor force surveys done to assess the impact, unfortunately, there was no automatic understanding that that information should be disaggregated by disability. And after so many years of working on the existence of ways in which that can be done, it was still very disappointing to see that that this did not happen. And I think that is something that we need to remember for future crises. Disability inclusion is not yet there as part of the automatic crisis response by governments. And I think that is something that next time we need to do better from the outset. Because as you know, when you don't have statistical evidence, you have to rely on anecdotal evidence. And okay, that's important, but it's not equally good. So I think that is there. Now, the anecdotal evidence, mostly collected also by the International Disability Alliance and other disability organizations, is that definitely persons with disabilities were very strongly impacted by COVID-19, not only on from a health point of view. We've seen that with very high mortality rates, for instance, for people with disabilities living in institutions, but also the socioeconomic impact has been strong. I'm sure Muteza can speak better about that and the impact of Bangladesh, but especially if you think about persons with disabilities working in the informal economy, in developing countries, confinement measures, social distancing, all that made it almost impossible to continue getting income into their households. Now that's the negative part. The more positive part is that in the context of the private sector, and Stephen, as you know, we work a lot with the private sector in the context of the ILO Global Business and Disability Network, what we saw is that after, I would say, an almost normal moment where we were all struggling, when everybody was struggling with the new situation, we have seen that the private sector in general, and of course, a better example and not so good example, the private sector in general has maintained its commitment to disability inclusion if that already existed before. So the companies that are in our network, the national networks that are part also of our global network, there has been sort of a reaffirmation of the commitment to disability inclusion. And if we have seen already, we saw last year and this year again, there's even been more companies joining our network and more national networks being established than in previous years. So there's a bit of a positive message coming from that. We've also heard that to some extent, there is an increased awareness within the private sector that diversity and inclusion, and I know we'll come back to that in a minute, and disability inclusion as part of that is somehow coming out of the crisis as something that is perceived by companies not as something that is only there to be done when times are nice, but also as part of the solution to come out of that crisis. Now, I might be a bit too optimistic, but we've definitely seen companies that where the commitment to disability inclusion has even been strengthened during the pandemic. The other two things which I say, and then I'll finish with that. First is the pandemic has shown that companies can very quickly adjust their way of working to the pandemic. The whole telework, which seemed impossible before, suddenly overnight almost it was done. Platforms were made accessible, which were not fully accessible before. And we're seeing that also today. So the pandemic has shown that if there is a things can change pretty quickly. And I'm not saying by that telework should now become the solution for persons with disabilities. It's not that. But I think the pandemic has shown that adjustments in the process can be done pretty quickly. And I think that is important also for persons with disabilities. And the other issue, I would say, the other sort of silver lining is mental health. Now, mental health and disability are not the same as we all know, but there's a lot of overlap there. And I think that what the crisis has done is that discussions around mental health are coming out of the closet. Now, it is now okay to ask each other, how are you doing mental health? We're seeing organizations being much more concerned, and rightly so, about the mental health of their employees. And I think that will also help persons with psychosocial disabilities. So a few positive messages also that result for me from the crisis. I'll stop there, Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. I appreciate that. Let's go to Murtaza and get his view on things from Bangladesh and other developing country experiences. I think that, you know, here in North America and Europe, we have a bit of a grip on some of this stuff, but from some of my other work, talking to people in developing countries, the situation around the pandemic is really still in a serious crisis phase. So, Murtaza, what's your sense of this? You know, people with disabilities and COVID recovery. I mean, but let me ask you this: are we even in a COVID recovery phase in some of these countries, or are we still in the throes of the pandemic? I don't know the answer to that. Murtaza?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Well, in Bangladesh, actually, so I mean, if we look at the duration of COVID and when it hit in 2020, the initial phase was very difficult. Of course, I mean, as a large portion of the population, of course, works with small and medium enterprises, and that sector was very badly hit. Now, if we look at developing countries, broadly speaking, I mean, right now we're in a relatively better situation than many other countries. Cases are really low. The economy is open back up, and we are, I would say, slowly heading towards recovery in the sense that lockdowns have ended. But of course, we're now seeing the African variant, you know, causing some concerns in certain parts, other parts of the world. So I think it's sort of, yeah, geographically driven to some extent. But if I can share a bit about our experience, I mean, to Stefan's point about that anecdotal evidence, that's sort of what we received right when COVID hit, was stories of, okay, people with disabilities are almost the first in line to lose jobs, unfortunately, or in some cases it was even concerns of, and as you know, for example, one of the biggest formal employers in Bangladesh is the apparel industry. And many of the people who work there come from villages and other parts of the country. So when the lockdowns hit, they had to go back to their homes in the villages, and many, especially people with disabilities, were perhaps advised not to return or to return at a later point in time. Transportation, those kinds of things, of course, presented much bigger challenges amidst lockdowns and changing rules, things of that nature. So it was, in addition to that economic impact, you know, just the rules from the health guideline perspective that had an initial major impact. Of course, now, as I'm mentioning, things reopening, we are seeing employers coming forward and coming back and looking at recruitment again and getting back into their drive towards disability inclusion. So that's probably been a bit more of an encouraging sign, I would say, in the last 3 months or so. And prior to that, there have been efforts made to go towards digital solutions. I mean, again, to what Stefan was saying in terms of trying to see how do we deploy, you know, online job fairs, for example, something we used to do offline before, or things like making the job sites accessible for people with disabilities so that even from rural settings, they could connect to employment. And that, of course, then also made clear the digital divide that exists, in the sense that suddenly location plays a key role, and whether you have good internet infrastructure or not, or access to devices, or your digital literacy levels. So I think all of these things will kind of be key drivers coming out into the recovery phase, and seeing how those issues can be addressed if we are to make use of these, what could potentially be enablers if they are you know, made inclusive and accessible in the right way. So those are kind of some of the things we've seen. And as we did mention, the gender aspect of things, of course, that also presents a specific set of challenges. I mean, some of the programs we're working across, there are, of course, very specific gender targets as well, for including women with disabilities. And we've seen a big challenge on that front as well, as there are a lot of sociocultural factors to take in, and families, of course, also playing a key role. So a lot of these context-specific things that are coming up. And when you're looking at, for example, accessing higher education roles, or where you would require digitally sophisticated skills. We're seeing much fewer candidates who are women coming forward or being eligible for roles like that. So I think there's been a lot of learnings, a lot of things we've seen across different segments of the workforce. However, now that things are slowly recovering, we are seeing that interest continue where it was there before. And if anything, people are feeling a bit more empathetic and wanting to and have the sense that we need to get out of this crisis together. So there is that sense of perhaps reaching out and doing more for even marginalized communities. And the other side of this is, of course, SMEs, in the sense that they are the backbone of our economy. And it's an area us as a network we haven't really addressed too closely in the past, but we see that growing need right now as a big focus of our government in terms of their stimulus packages and things of that nature, is to see how the SMEs are really recovered, as they provide more than 80% of the jobs in the economy. So how do we ensure that there's, accessibility and inclusion on the agenda of those kinds of institutions is definitely a new area of interest in our context. So I'll stop here for the moment, Steve. Thanks.
Thanks, Murtaza. It's interesting times for sure. You both mentioned issues around data and so on. And I know here in Canada, I've been involved with a couple of academic research pieces to try and actually gather some data around COVID and disability and stuff. It hasn't been particular to employment things, but there have been some initiatives around this. And I wonder, Francis, if you could speak to that in the Canadian context, and just about your sense of, where we are in the COVID recovery here in Canada for people with disabilities in the job market and stuff, because it's been really quite devastating for an awful lot of folks.
No, for sure. Maybe some reflections. I think, in a sense, if we look at the flow through of the pandemic from an economic standpoint, because I am in the economic department, we saw rapid shutdown and quick impacts on certain groups, including impacts of isolation and impacts of companies being shut down. In Canada, we're actually seeing a fairly rapid recovery of the economy writ large. But we're not seeing it evenly in sectors. And so one of the things that the pandemic did show us is a number of fragilities to our own economy. And so I think I'll touch on the data element, but I think we're in an interesting moment in time where there might be an opportunity. Governments are acting and thinking about the structure of their economies, the structure of their workforces in different ways, and are thinking about sort of their industrial bases in different ways. There's going to be, particularly in the US, but in Canada as well, a massive infrastructure spend. And if we think about that infrastructure spend, it also presents a really important opportunity for issues of accessibility. How we build back our infrastructure and think about it will determine in many ways how accessible our cities are for years to come. And so there's sort of an important dynamic there. The structure and the nature and the association around employment and what it means to go into work has also shifted. So I just talked about an investment in infrastructure. Countries around the world, Canada certainly through things like the Canada Digital Adoption Program, are massively thinking about issues of digital adoption, issues of broadband adoption, and thinking also what it means for people to be able to work in different ways, partly in the office, not in the office, supported by digital tool. How we think about that and who we engage in the development of these programs and the implementation of the programs is also going to be sort of a generational investment that we need to think about. And then, Steve, we've talked before about things like the 50/30 initiative. Governments, Canada is one I'm most familiar with, but are thinking about the recovery and thinking about what kind of communities and economies they want in the future. And at least within Canada, the thematics have been around things like greener, fairer, more resilient, and more inclusive. And inclusive, not just because it's the right thing to do, because right now we're actually facing labor shortages. And so being able to tap into our entire workforce and make sure that people are able to contribute actually has a strong economic imperative that has to drive about how we think and empower people to participate fully in the workforce. So I actually think in Canada, from the data perspective, we've been making active strides. And I was talking to Statistics Canada before, and we actually have improved, I think, in terms of the capture of data. There's still a ways to go, but there is sort of a concerted effort there. I think when we get around issues of disability, there's still an imperfect component of that, which is that it is based and has to be based on self-identification, and we don't always have the best data or the most real data. But StatsCan is thinking about that. But mainly my message to people now is, I think we are at a time and space where governments, along with industries, are thinking about what the economy and the workplace will be for times to come, and are making significant investments that, if we do them right, actually could lay the seeds for a more inclusive economy and opportunities for people to participate fully in the economy.
Thanks. I appreciate that. As you're talking, I'm reminded of a conversation I had yesterday with a Government of Canada person talking about going forward and how, you know, here in Canada and in a lot of countries, one of the ways that we dealt with the pandemic is we've spent quite a lot of money, and it seems inevitable that there's going to have to be a recalibration around that. And the word austerity was used in the discussion that I had. I haven't heard that from any government officials or anything. But I think that the point that this individual was making was that those who are involved in disability-related work in government are particularly concerned as we move into this austerity time because of the lack of data, because many other constituencies are much better able to substantiate the situation that they're in and the impacts that their communities have had, and so on. So as I say, we haven't talked about this before, and if you don't have anything to say about it, that's okay, we can move on. But I just wanted to take advantage of all of your expertise around this, because I've been really stuck on this since the person said it, because I think that, you know, myself as a disability advocate, folks who are involved in government programming and disability advocacy, as we move forward into a time when the world is trying to correct some of the massive imbalances that have occurred in the last 23 or 24 months. Those who have the better arguments, the better economic arguments, are going to be the ones who have more success in moving their agendas forward. And you've all talked about challenges with data and things, and I think we all acknowledge that. So let me just toss it out to you, and if any of you have some thoughts on that, I'd welcome them. If not, we can move on.
I'm happy to give some initial thoughts, and I think it's true that, you know, governments ebb and flow, and there are moments of higher spending, lower spending, and for sure the availability of data and to make the case is always important. I think what we probably need to be thinking is beyond sort of dedicated funds and programmings for people with disability, to be thinking about the totality of our programs and building in how we think about our contributions programs, our spending programs, so that the totality of our funds are considered with an inclusive lens and are considered and designed from the outset to be able to support all peoples, and in particular people with disability, where the programs are relevant. So it's not a full answer, and there's always a risk, and, you know, issues will wane full. But I think what we're hoping to learn or hoping to build in is the capacity to consider accessibility and people with disabilities from the onset of programs, and to be honest, to consider the full measure of sort of equity seeking groups and inclusion as we develop programs. And I think there's an element of skill and capacity that we need to build into our civil service and people who develop programs so that they can do that on an ongoing basis. And I don't think that those skills or that knowledge gets lost. So if we build in the capacity, money will go up and go down, but the capacity to integrate it into the program, whatever it might be, hopefully stays as a function of our skills within the civil service.
Yeah, I would like to, I fully agree with Francis, what he just said. I think there's also a need by the disability sector to pay much more attention to disability inclusion in mainstream initiatives than focusing too much on disability specific initiatives. No? That's one element, but I would add two more elements. One is, I think there's a clear trend for digitalization that is coming out of. That was already there before when we spoke about the future of work. We had already identified that in the ILO, but in others, of course. But COVID-19 has exponentially increased the trend towards digitalization. And now I think we have a huge opportunity there, but we need to be proactive on that to ensure that the significant part of these new jobs, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, blockchain, website accessibility is on the rise, that a significant part of these jobs go to persons with disabilities. But that requires public-private partnerships. Mutesa knows we have an initiative called Digital in Demand in 5 Asia-Pacific countries to try to really see what can we do together to ensure that we have a pipeline of people with disabilities that can access these jobs. And I think what Mutesa, you said about the digital gap is important. Remember, we also need to make particular efforts to ensure that women with disabilities are part of that. No? So then we have a very huge opportunity, but it's an opportunity that will work out if we are proactively promoting that. The other issue I would say is, I think the crisis has also identified and also the more sort of structural discussion around climate change is that there needs to be more government intervention in general. You know, this whole this Washington consensus. Now people are starting to speak about the Cornwall consensus. One of these G7 meetings where governments were basically saying, well, can no longer sort of let the markets decide. We need to take action. Otherwise, climate change we're not going to make any progress on climate change. And I think the crisis has also identified the systemic failures that we have. No? So I think there is a bit of an increase in the perception that there needs to be more government intervention on these issues. And I think that is also something that we can bring to our advantage. For instance, by also ensuring that in all measures that are done to address climate change, there are also employment opportunities coming from that. And with the same logic as digital employment, again, if we ensure that some of these employment opportunities go to persons with disabilities, again, we have some opportunities there. But as I said, it requires our action. It's not something that will fall on us automatically, but we need to proactively promote and make the most out of these opportunities. But I would focus on these opportunities that are out there, and I think we should focus our attention on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. Appreciate that. Murtaza, have you any thoughts you'd like to share before we move on?
Yeah, a couple of reflections in terms of how to embed into government spending. It was interesting to hear Francis's comments as well in terms of how that capacity is built within the government apparatus, if you will, to actually ensure that these things are getting embedded. And this is one of the kind of perennial challenges we have in a country like Bangladesh. Often the people who are in charge of budgets and things of that nature or specific departments have very low awareness of disability related issues or how it should actually be put in, or someone changes the department and suddenly that knowledge is lost. So that capacity development of civil service is actually very important to see these things through. And also what we see sometimes is, development partners coming in with, really great programs. I mean, we're working on a couple right now, and we're seeing these great learnings that are coming out, new ways of building partnerships with local organizations of people with disabilities, say in the skills sector, for example. And then once the program kind of pulls out, and even though there are government institutions tagged to it, unless there's a proper budget allocation on a yearly basis to see that through, a lot of these initiatives cannot sustain. And that's an area, a network can't do much, neither can these institutions on their own unless that support is there on a yearly basis. So indeed, there is that issue of competing agendas, and how you move this up the priority list is important. So I think that constant advocacy is a key part of it. And it's a challenge we are trying to see how it can be overcome, but it's has been a major stumbling block in terms of scaling some of the great initiatives or innovations that have come up in the last couple of years.
Great, thanks. It's an interesting discussion. I wonder if we might pause here and see if there are any comments or questions from people who are joining us. Maureen, what do you think? How can we do this?
So there are no questions yet, either in the chat or in the Q&A box, but I would encourage people. I would encourage people, as you've been doing, Steve, to.
You think everybody's awake?
I think so. It's fascinating, really, really interesting information in a global perspective, right? Which is what we want. Sometimes we are isolated in our countries, not knowing what's going on an international stage for employment for people with disabilities, especially during COVID. So I'm sure nobody's asleep.
Oh, okay, that's fine. That's fine. We have another piece that we wanted to cover here. And Maureen?
So I have somebody saying, I am listening, but can't think of a question yet.
There's no pressure at all, we have another discussion point that we wanted to get into. And this came from a discussion I had with Francis the other day. We're talking about the fact that here in Canada, and I think more generally, there's an increasing awareness in the corporate world about the importance of diversity and inclusion. And one of the people that has joined us in these panels before, Caroline Casey from the UK or Ireland, has spearheaded an initiative called the Valuable 500, in which she has targeted 500 global corporations to rewrite their inclusivity language to include people with disabilities, because it's been her observation and the observation of others that very often, while the corporate sector has really begun to understand that the world is not all middle-aged white men, thank God for that, but they finally begin to understand that, and that there's value for their bottom line in paying attention to it. At least here in Canada, very often the discussions around diversity and inclusion talk about gender, they talk about sexual orientation, they talk about indigeneity, they talk about ethnicity, but they never talk about disability as part of that. And as a fellow who's been in the trenches on the disability rights world for more than a quarter century, I find it deeply perplexing because not only is it true that people with disabilities are part of the diversity of humankind, but we're also a pretty big part of it. You know, 15% globally, they say, 1 billion people globally, they say. And yet, so often, there's no discussion and no recognition of this. You folks have alluded to it in terms of moving forward on the pandemic and making sure that inclusivity agendas bring in disability. And I think we need to do that. But I do think we need to do that starting from the base that, as Murtaza said, there are conflicting and competing agendas here. And, you know, people with disabilities here in Canada, in Bangladesh, where I've traveled, and other places are very often just simply not part of the discussion. And I don't want to put this into a sour grapes kind of a thing. I'm not here whining about this, okay? Even if it seems that way. But I just wonder if you all have some reflections as to why this may be the case, and maybe some sense of positive ways forward. So we haven't set up a speaking order here. If there's anybody who'd like to jump in, I'd be relieved to have some help.
I can give it a first go. Look, again, a mixed messages. I think on one hand, it's fair to say I've been working in this area for more than 30 years. So it's fair to say that there is an unprecedented level to persons with disabilities also in the private sector. And we see that with initiatives like the one you mentioned, Valuable for Funded, the ILO Global Business and Disability Network, more than 30 national networks like the one that Murtaza is leading in Bangladesh. So also in a developing country context, we see an increasing level of interest in the private sector. And I would say with a good narrative. No, it's not about we need to do it because we have a quota or we want to do it because we want to be nice. No, the narrative is good. It's a narrative that very much uses diversity and inclusion language, basically by recognizing that it's good for companies to have a diverse workforce. It leads to better products and services. It leads to motivation. And within that broader concept, disability inclusion is part of that. So that is positive. Having said that, it's fair to say that in the diversity and inclusion agenda, disability is a poor relative. No? You have, as you were saying, gender is always there, race is there, even more now thanks to Black Lives Matter, and rightly so. LGBTI also is much more present in most countries, I have to say, than disability. Age is also pretty absent there. No? And I think to some extent we need, why is that the case? Well, for a number of reasons. I don't think we have time to discuss it, but I think one message that we need to bring very strongly across, and Caroline Casey has been very good about that, is a company cannot claim to be diverse and inclusive if disability is not part of that spectrum. I mean, it needs to be a catalog of issues, needs to be part of that. And they cannot say, no, this year is not disability, this year we do sexual orientation, next year we do, this is not an issue that one year you do disability, the next year you do, no. These are issues that need to be permanently on the agenda of companies. And just one final issue that I will throw in is intersectionality. I mean, we see an increasing attention to the term intersectionality. We all know that we are not, we have different issues all as persons. And I think the increased attention to intersectionality should hopefully also lead to a more systematic and permanent attention to disability within diversity and inclusion discussions. No? But I think the analysis is correct. No? It is definitely not getting yet the attention it should get. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. I think your point about intersectionality and that as a framework really is a hopeful way of looking at this and going forward. I wonder, Murtaza or Francis, if you have any thoughts you'd like to share.
Yeah, sure, Steve. In the context of Bangladesh, most of our society, unfortunately, is still stuck in that welfare or medical model or a charity model towards disability, unfortunately, and that's the initial reference point with which people think about it, despite the fact that we have the Rights and Protection of Persons with Disabilities Act in the country, which is aligned with the UN CRPD. But the initial conversations, even in some cases when I have with employers now, is still through that lens of, okay, this falls under the philanthropy or corporate social responsibility bucket. And for example, going up to one of the employers and saying, oh, we have some candidates who we would be look to place with you and help you build your disability confidence. You're like, okay, we'll think of some positions that they could perhaps fulfill. And then the conversation shifted towards, no, we would like to know what positions you have available, so that they have qualifications and they have skills, and we want to put this as a diversity and inclusion agenda, what Stefan was mentioning, rather than looking at it from a different lens. So in a place like Bangladesh, that's sort of where we're starting from, as a base. So I think because of that history of the way it's been positioned in the past, and even when you speak to people with disabilities who are coming up the education ladder, they often say, look, we often aspire to either join the civil service because the government has a quota or had a quota, or development organizations, because they're probably more sympathetic to our cause. So that's been the typical thinking, whether that's candidates with disabilities or coming up the education system, or society at large. However, that being said, there are of course now more progressive organizations who are working in countries like Bangladesh. We see multinationals who've been able to influence their supply chains, and we are seeing that conversation shift. Even if the starting point is still, what I was just describing, they are willing to open up to that once they see others are doing this. It is possible, it is happening in the country. And what is working for us now, what we're really trying to focus on, is to reach other networks of employers. So, how can we engage with the IT and software association, so we can come up with a strategy for that sector, or for example, the apparel industry, or the foreign investors, where a lot of the multinationals are there. So we're trying to take this, well, of course, our network has a lot of inclusive employers and disability organizations within it. But if we can connect to these institutions who have very sector specific expertise and interests, then I think that can really be a way to amplify and speed up the process and get a lot more buy-in. And what we're seeing is, when employers get that confidence from each other's experience, it can be a real eye-opener. It gives them that confidence to work in this space in a more confident way than otherwise. So that's been working well for us. And for example, recently the ILO GBDN had an Asia Pacific conference where we learned about, for example, Pizza Hut in Sri Lanka working with a very interesting model that could easily translate to Domino's in Bangladesh, who we're working with. So getting these playbooks that can work at a sector specific way, I think would be very valuable to, help to build the capacity of the employers and work in that sense. And the other final thing I would say is that we're seeing development partners putting inclusion targets now into, for example, skills building programs that partners like the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank are undertaking in Bangladesh. So when more people with disabilities are coming through the skills system, or will be, I think it's a much better discussion, as employers at the end of the day, where the rubber hits the road is when they do that recruitment and the way they're sort of judging the performance on their D&I indicators. So we're seeing that need to build up the supply as we also work on the demand side of the equation. So yeah, I'll leave it there, Steve. Thanks.
It's interesting. You talk about the ADB and the World Bank and so on. And I mean, I've been involved with projects with the ADB over the years. And I'm just, I mean, it seems to me that a lot of this stuff in countries where, as you say, Murtaza, you kind of still live a lot, you know, the conceptualization around disability is still in a welfare model kind of a way. And I wonder if, and maybe this is a discussion for another day, but I wonder if there's a real role in countries like that for mechanisms like the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank to help kind of drive these sorts of sector initiatives that you're talking about. Now, if you have a quick response to that, then fine. If not, let's just park it and come back to it another day.
Yeah, a quick response would be that I think they have a very important role to play in the sense that they also hold a very key position in the negotiating table with very key stakeholders such as the government, of course, and the private sector actors. And as you know, when these conditionalities come in to program structuring, on the one hand, it of course mandates it so that it stays on the agenda and it can actually cut through on the priority list, you know, in a way that, you know, perhaps the target wasn't there in the past, or you know, it was an afterthought, as we were saying, the poor cousin of the whole diversity agenda. So I think they can play a very key role, and it's very encouraging for us to have these actors speaking about this, because that wasn't necessarily the case before the SDGs in the same way.
Sure, thank you for that. Francis, what's your thinking about this from the Canadian perspective, from your own perspective? We're drawing ourselves to a close here, so let me give you the floor.
Sure. I mean, thinking about sort of the initial premise of sort of disability being, I guess, the poor cousin or the area where people have not been paying attention. I actually think from sort of a framework, or rules, or laws, you know, disability is figured out probably as prominently and is being built in our programs. We've tended to build in, I think we have an implementation, like I think we have a how do we put it in place type of problem. A lot of our programs tend to think about recruitment and bringing into the workplace. They tend to think about bias and ongoing discrimination that may prevent people from sort of moving up their careers. But if we have if we don't have a talent pipeline, if we don't have a line of sight and sort of built up the thinking right from the outset and from sort of the education system, you've got a sort of initial issue there. If we have workplaces, whether it's in the private or the public sector, that themselves are not accessible or don't provide accommodations or support the provision of accommodations, you can be setting up people to fail in that environment. We need to be thinking about that. If there are costs associated to adaptations, and those are held at the manager level, we may be creating sort of barriers for hiring and promotion, and thinking about sort of enabling people to work in ways that allow them to bring in their full contribution. So beyond sort of like from the initial onset, and I think that's why we need to think about things from like co-creation and thinking through the full life cycle of initiatives. Like beyond the initial design, I think we need to be thinking about our issues around implementations, because because the people with disabilities are actually a fairly large tent, and the needs can vary quite a bit across the community, and how we need to support people can vary quite a bit. And so while I think we're probably not, I think people with disabilities, and I think accessibility is a consideration from the onset, I think we don't necessarily, or haven't done as good a job as we can in terms of the implementation and the thinking through sort of from beginning to end of our programs and our staffing and the development of our organizations.
Thanks, Francis. Let me turn to Maureen and see if there are any questions or comments. We're about 5 minutes away from the end. So Have there been any questions or comments, Maureen?
There is one question that I think would be really good for this group, and I think you've answered it in different ways already. But the question is, who owns the challenge is at the root of employment for disability people, right? Is it business? Is it government, community leaders, or all of us? We need to get to where it's widely recognized that we all own it, and we can fix it with commitment of multiple stakeholders working on the shared vision of helping as many people as possible become gainfully and equitably employed. And I think that to put that kind of into a thought question is, how do we encourage that to happen? How do we encourage all of us to be working together?
Okay, fellas, what do you have to say? I'm just a moderator here.
Look, well, first, I think it's a good. I definitely agree that this is a joint job. We can only achieve the result and shorten the gap, the employment gap that exists if everybody. When we speak about this issue, think about employment in the private sector, we basically say three things. We say we have to work in parallel on three issues. We need to have more disability inclusive and confident employers, public and private. We need to have people with disabilities having the skills that the labor market is demanding, digital skills, for instance, which again is not only, it's a responsibility of individuals, but also mostly of government and vocational training providers. And we need to have an enabling environment. We need to have social protection system that supports employment. We need to have infrastructure and transport that is accessible. We need to have awareness raising campaigns, etc., etc. You need to work on all these three elements if you need to start making progress. And I think to work on those issues, we need the involvement of government. It's the primary responsibility, but also very important of the private sector, and of course also of trade unions, very important for us in the ILO, but also of course with a very active involvement of disability organizations. Thank you.
Thanks, Devin. As you're talking, I'm reminded of our days 20 years ago, drafting the convention, and talking about the interconnectedness of rights and so on. And we have this discussion in the context of the CRPD. And while I would support everything that you said, the other thing that occurred to me is you're not going to deal with issues around employment until you deal with issues around education or transportation or discrimination or things like that. Employment alone is not going to be solved without those other things. So it really needs to be a holistic approach to things. And I think that, it's important to keep that bigger picture in mind as we go forward. Francis, did you have something you wanted to say? I'm not sure. It's just a function of the Zoom thing here. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Not at all. Listen, to the question, who owns the challenge? It is a societal challenge, I think, and which means we all own communally, I think, components of that. Certainly, the citizens, civil society, in terms of bringing sort of the conversation to the forefront, building awareness, there's certainly a role for that. Governments, in terms of setting the frameworks, determining how money is going to be allocated, thinking about programs, is there as well. Businesses, in terms of their own workplaces, and holding themselves to account. That's the reason we put out things like the 50-30 challenge, where we ask business to hold themselves to account on issues of inclusion, including disability, and to put plans in place. People demanding that corporation. So it's a broad-based societal challenge that we all have a part to play. And I think conversations like today, bringing them to the forefront and ensuring that, or doing our best to make sure that dialogue continues, is sort of an important element to spur action in all the sectors, to spur action in government, to spur action in businesses. So I was just reacting to who owns. Like all broad societal challenge, we all own a part of it, I think.
Thanks, Francis. I appreciate that. We're just about at the end of our time. Murtaza, did you have anything you wanted to say as we come to a close? And again, not to put you on the spot.
Well, I think on this particular issue, both Stefan and Francis have covered it really well. There's not really much more to add. I would completely endorse what both of them have said.
Okay, that's great. Then let's move to wrap things up here. I think we're just a couple of minutes away from the end of our time. I just wanted to say to you all how much I enjoy these opportunities to get together and have these kinds of conversations, because I always learn a lot when we do this, and I find that, you know, a real pleasure. But it's interesting for me as we gather here on the 1st of December, because December this year marks a lot of anniversaries. It'll be 20 years ago in December, I think on the 3rd of December, that at the UN's anti-racism conference in Durban, the Mexican government moved the motion that started the ball rolling for the ad hoc committee. So that's a pretty big thing. And it's 15 years ago on December 13th that the General Assembly adopted the convention, or however it's called, and opened it for signature. So, you know, as Stefan said, he's been at this for 30 years, as have I. And while in many ways it's frustrating work, looking at it over the long arc of time, it's also very, very positive work. I see a number of really significant advances, and it's no question, it's due in no small part to work by folks like yourselves. So let me close by saying thank you for participating in the panel today, and thank you for all the good things that you do. Happy International Day of People with Disabilities.
So thank you, Steve. Thank you to the panelists. So appreciative of your time, your knowledge, and everything that you're willing to impart on helping everybody in this conference understand where we are in Canada and compared to the rest of the world. So I thank you very, very much for your insights. And Steve, excellent moderator. Thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, and being able to pull out those hard questions. So I thank you so much again for your time.